She was starving, pregnant, and had nowhere else to turn. When Delilah Ross walked into that saloon in 1887, she was ready to beg the biggest, scariest man in town to marry her just so she could survive. Bear Dalton was 6'6" and had spent his whole life believing no woman could ever love a giant like him. But when this desperate woman dropped to her knees in front of him, something stirred in his heart that he thought had died years ago. He said yes, not knowing it would change everything. What started as an act of mercy became something neither of them expected. Could two lonely souls find love when they had given up hope? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered planks of Bear Dalton's front porch as he sat with his coffee, watching the mist rise from the valley below. His ranch stretched out like a green carpet between the pine-covered hills, cattle dotting the pasture like scattered stones. At 52, Bear had built something solid here in the Montana Territory, something that would outlast him. But as he rolled his father's wedding ring between his thick fingers, a habit he'd developed over the year, she couldn't shake the feeling that all his hard work meant nothing without someone to share it with. The ring had been gathering dust in his bureau drawer for 30 years, ever since his father passed. Bear had never had cause to wear it himself. At 6'6" and broad as a barn door, he'd learned early that his size frightened people more than it comforted them. Children would hide behind their mothers' skirts when he came to town. Women would cross the street rather than walk past him on the boardwalk. Even grown men would step aside with nervous glances, as if his mere presence might bring trouble. Bear's mother used to tell him that God made him big so he could protect the smaller folk, but she'd been gone 15 years now, and Bear had begun to wonder if maybe God had just made a mistake. The loneliness had settled into his bones like winter cold, and some mornings he wondered if the cattle were the only living things that would ever feel comfortable in his presence. The sound of wagon wheels on the dirt road pulled him from his thoughts. Old Pete Mackenzie was making his weekly supply run to town, and he raised a weathered hand in greeting as he passed. Bear lifted his coffee cup in acknowledgement, grateful for even that small human connection. Pete was one of the few neighbors who didn't seem intimidated by Bear's size, though their conversations rarely extended beyond discussions of weather and cattle prices. Bear's ranch sat at the end of a long valley, surrounded by peaks that turned purple in the evening light. He'd chosen this spot not just for the good grazing and clear water, but for the privacy it offered. Here, he could go days without seeing another soul, and no one had to endure his unsettling presence. The isolation had been a blessing when he was younger, but now it felt more like a prison of his own making. The house itself reflected his solitary existence, functional but sparse. He'd built it with his own hands, cutting the logs and laying the stone foundation, but he'd never bothered with the finishing touches that made a house feel like a home. The walls were bare except for a few practical items, a calendar, a rifle rack, and a photograph of his parents, taken shortly before their deaths. The furniture was sturdy but plain, built to accommodate his large frame rather than to impress visitors he never had. Bear's daily routine had become as predictable as the sunrise. He rose before dawn, tended to the animals, rode out to check the fences and water sources, returned for a simple meal, and spent the evenings reading by lamplight or working on small repairs around the ranch. It was a good life, he told himself, honest and productive, but the silence that filled his evenings had grown heavier with each passing year. He thought often about his parents, especially his father, who had been nearly as large as Bear, but had somehow managed to win the heart of a petite schoolteacher from Denver. They'd been devoted to each other, and Bear had grown up believing that such love was possible for him too. But his father had possessed a gentleness that seemed to balance his imposing size, a quality that Bear feared he lacked. Where his father had been soft-spoken and thoughtful, Bear felt clumsy and tongue-tied, especially around women. The few times he'd attempted courtship had ended in disaster. There was Margaret Henley, who had seemed interested, until she saw him split firewood with his bare hands. The look of fear in her eyes had haunted him for months. Then there was Sarah Collins, who had accepted his invitation to a church social, but spent the entire evening pressed against the wall, looking for an escape route. After that, Bear had stopped trying altogether. Meanwhile, 300 miles south in the failing farm town of Bitter Creek, Delilah Ross was facing her own kind of desperation. At 39, she had the worn look of a woman who had been ground down by circumstances beyond her control. Her cheekbones stood out sharp against her thin face, and her once bright eyes had dulled to the color of winter sky. The dress she wore had been mended so many times that it was more patch than original fabric, but she kept it clean and pressed because dignity was about all she had left. The drought had been merciless that summer, turning the wheat fields to dust and driving most of the farmers away to seek work in the cities. Delilah's husband, Thomas, had been one of the unlucky ones who stayed too long, borrowing money against the farm until the bank finally foreclosed. What happened to Thomas after that was a story Delilah preferred not to think about: the gambling debts, the desperate schemes, the night he disappeared, leaving only a note saying he was sorry and wouldn't be back. That was 6 months ago, and Delilah had been surviving on the charity of neighbors who had barely enough for themselves. She'd taken in washing and mending, cleaned houses, and even helped with harvesting on the few farms that had managed to grow anything. But work was scarce, and she was beginning to show signs of the pregnancy she'd discovered just weeks after Thomas left. The baby growing inside her was both a blessing and a curse. She wanted this child with fierce desperation, but she knew that an unmarried woman with a baby would find even fewer opportunities for honest work. The town gossips were already whispering about her situation, and she could see the judgment in their eyes when she passed on the street. It was Mrs. Henderson from the general store who first mentioned Bear Dalton. "There's a rancher up in Whiskey Bend," she'd said while sorting through a basket of mending. "Big fellow, keeps to himself mostly, never married. From what I hear, might be he'd have use for a housekeeper." The idea had taken root in Delilah's mind, like a seed in fertile soil. She'd heard stories about mail-order brides and practical marriages on the frontier, arrangements that served both parties' needs without the complications of romance. Maybe a man like Bear Dalton would appreciate having someone to cook and clean in exchange for room and board. Maybe he wouldn't ask too many questions about her past or her condition. The journey to Whiskey Bend had taken her last $3 and 2 days of uncomfortable travel on a freight wagon. She'd arrived dusty and exhausted, carrying everything she owned in a small carpet bag. The town was bigger than Bitter Creek, but still small enough that everyone would know her business within a week. She'd asked directions to the saloon, figuring that would be the best place to get information about local ranchers. The Copper Dollar Saloon was dimly lit and smelled of tobacco and whiskey. A few men sat at the bar, and others played cards at a corner table. Delilah hesitated in the doorway, suddenly aware of how desperate she must look. But hunger was a powerful motivator, and the tiny life growing inside her deserved better than slow starvation. "You looking for someone, miss?" The bartender was a middle-aged man with kind eyes and graying hair. "I'm looking for information about a rancher named Bear Dalton," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. The conversation in the saloon had quieted, and she could feel the men's eyes on her. One of them, a wiry fellow with a grizzled beard, spoke up. "Bear's a good man, but he don't come to town much. Keeps to himself up in the mountains." "I need to find him," Delilah said, desperation creeping into her voice despite her efforts to stay calm. "It's important." The men exchanged glances, and she could see the curiosity in their faces. The bartender leaned forward. "He usually comes in for supplies on Saturdays. That's tomorrow. You might catch him then." "I don't have until tomorrow," Delilah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to find him today." That was when the saloon doors swung open and Bear Dalton walked in. Even stooped slightly to fit through the doorway, he seemed to fill the entire space. His shadow fell across the floor like a dark curtain, and the other men instinctively shifted to give him room. He wore work clothes that had seen better days, and his boots were caked with mud from the mountain trails. Bear's eyes found Delilah immediately, drawn perhaps by the sudden silence in the saloon. She looked up at him and up and up until her neck craned back to meet his gaze. In that moment, she realized that all the stories about his size had been understatements. He was massive, but there was something gentle in his brown eyes that gave her courage. "Mr. Dalton?" she said, her voice catching slightly. He nodded, his expression curious but not unkind. "That's me." Delilah took a deep breath and stepped forward. The moment had come, and there was no turning back now. Everything she'd planned to say, the careful words she'd rehearsed during the long journey, abandoned her in the face of this mountain of a man who might be her only hope for survival. "I need to speak with you," she said, her hands trembling as she clutched her carpet bag. "It's about something that could change both our lives." Bear's massive frame went completely still as he studied the thin woman standing before him. Something in her eyes, a mixture of desperation and determination, told him this wasn't a casual encounter. The other men in the saloon had gone silent, sensing the gravity of whatever was about to unfold. "We can talk outside," Bear said quietly, his deep voice carrying easily through the room. He gestured toward the door with one large hand, and Delilah nodded gratefully. The late afternoon sun was harsh after the dim interior of the saloon, and Delilah squinted as her eyes adjusted. Bear led her to a small bench beside the hitching post, his movements careful and deliberate. Even sitting, he towered over her, but she found his presence oddly comforting rather than intimidating. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice gentler than she'd expected from such a large man. "Delilah Ross," she said, setting her carpet bag down beside her feet. Her hands were shaking, and she clasped them together to hide it. "I've come a long way to find you, Mr. Dalton." Bear waited patiently, giving her time to gather her courage. In the silence, Delilah could hear the sounds of the town around them, horses snorting, wagon wheels on dirt, the distant sound of children playing. Normal sounds of normal lives, while hers hung in the balance. "I'm going to ask you something," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something that might shock you, but I need you to hear me out before you answer." Bear nodded, his brown eyes never leaving her face. Delilah took a deep breath and slid off the bench, dropping to her knees in the dusty street before him. The action drew startled looks from passers-by, but she didn't care. This was her last chance, and she would swallow every bit of pride she had left if it meant survival. "Mr. Dalton," she said, looking up at his startled face, "I'm asking you to marry me." Bear's eyes widened, and for a moment he seemed too stunned to speak. Delilah rushed on before he could refuse. "I know how this must sound, coming from a stranger, but I'm desperate, and I've heard you're a good man. I have nowhere else to go, no family left, no way to make a living." Her voice broke slightly, but she forced herself to continue. "I'm with child, and I need a husband who can provide for us both. I'm not asking for love or romance. I'm asking for mercy." Bear stared down at her, his mind reeling. In all his lonely years, he'd imagined many scenarios, but this had never been one of them. A woman on her knees in the street, begging him to marry her, not out of affection but out of pure desperation. "Stand up," he said softly, reaching down to help her to her feet. His large hands engulfed her small ones, and he could feel how thin she'd become. "Please, don't kneel to me." Delilah stood but kept her eyes fixed on his face, searching for any sign of what his answer might be. Bear was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made her nervous. "The child," he said finally. "Where's the father?" "Gone," Delilah said simply. "He left when the farm failed, and I haven't heard from him since. The baby will be born without a father, unless—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Bear looked at this fragile woman standing before him, her torn dress carefully mended, her face gaunt from hunger, but still holding traces of the beauty she must have possessed before hardship wore her down. Something deep in his chest ached at the sight of her desperation. "I won't lie to you, Mrs. Ross," he said carefully. "I'm not an easy man to live with. I'm big, and I'm rough around the edges. I've been alone so long I've forgotten how to be around people. Most folks find me frightening." "You don't frighten me," Delilah said, and realized she meant it. Despite his imposing size, there was a gentleness in his manner that spoke of a kind heart. Bear was quiet again, turning something over in his mind. "If I said yes," he said slowly, "what would you expect from such an arrangement?" "A roof over my head and food for myself and the baby," Delilah said honestly. "I can cook, clean, mend clothes, tend a garden. I can work for my keep. I'm not looking for charity." "And I wouldn't be looking for a wife in the usual sense," Bear said, wanting to be completely clear. "I mean, I wouldn't expect. That is, you'd have your own room, your own space. No obligations beyond what you've mentioned." Relief flooded Delilah's face. "That's all I'm asking for." Bear stood up, his decision made. "Then yes, Mrs. Ross, I'll marry you." The words seemed to echo in the quiet street between them. Delilah felt her knees go weak with relief, and she had to grip the hitching post to keep from falling. "Thank you," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you." Bear felt an unfamiliar tightness in his throat as he watched her cry. When was the last time someone had been grateful for his presence instead of afraid of it? He cleared his throat awkwardly. "We should see about making it legal," he said. "Pastor Williams might be willing to perform a ceremony this evening if we explain the circumstances." Delilah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to compose herself. She reached into a carpet bag and pulled out a bundle wrapped in brown paper. "I brought this," she said, unfolding a dress that had once been white but was now more of a cream color. It was torn along one seam and showed signs of repeated mending, but it had been carefully cleaned and pressed. "It was my mother's," she explained. "I thought, if this day ever came, I wanted to wear something proper." Bear felt something shift in his chest as he looked at the old dress. This woman had traveled hundreds of miles with nothing but hope and a faded wedding dress, betting everything on the kindness of a stranger. "It's beautiful," he said, and meant it. An hour later, they stood in the small church at the edge of town, with Pastor Williams reading from his worn Bible. The preacher had asked no questions beyond the essential ones, perhaps recognizing desperation when he saw it. Bear had changed into his best shirt and pants, and Delilah wore her mother's dress, which hung loose on her thin frame but somehow still managed to make her look dignified. There were no witnesses except for the pastor's wife and the saloon keeper, who had followed them out of curiosity. No flowers, no music, no celebration. Just two lonely souls making a practical arrangement that might save them both. When Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, Bear hesitated for a moment before gently taking Delilah's hand. He bent down a long way down and placed a soft kiss on her forehead instead of her lips. It felt right somehow, that first gesture of their unconventional marriage. "Mrs. Dalton," he said quietly, and Delilah felt something inside her settle for the first time in months. She had a name again, a place in the world, someone who would stand between her and starvation. As they walked out of the church together, Bear carrying her single bag, Delilah realized that her torn wedding dresser mother's dress had served its purpose one more time. It had helped her claim a future when she'd thought all hope was lost. The sun was setting behind the mountains as Bear helped his new wife into his wagon for the journey to his ranch. Neither of them spoke during the long ride up the winding mountain road, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. They were both lost in thoughts of what they'd just done and what it might mean for the rest of their lives. When the ranch finally came into view in the moonlight, Delilah saw a solid log house surrounded by well-maintained outbuildings and fenced pastures. It looked like a place where a woman could build a life, where a child could grow up safe and fed. "Welcome home," Bear said softly as he helped her down from the wagon. Home. The word echoed in Delilah's mind as she followed her new husband toward the house. For the first time in months, she dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be all right. The morning light streaming through unfamiliar windows woke Delilah from the deepest sleep she'd had in months. For a moment, she lay still in the narrow bed, disoriented by the absence of hunger gnawing at her stomach. Then the events of the previous day came flooding back: the desperate proposal, the quiet wedding, the ride up the mountain to this solid log house that was now her home. She could hear movement in the kitchen below, the sound of someone trying to be quiet but not quite succeeding. Bear was already up, probably had been for hours if his routine was anything like other ranchers she'd known. Delilah sat up carefully, testing how she felt. The nausea that had plagued her for weeks seemed less severe this morning, perhaps because she'd actually had a proper meal the night before. When Bear had shown her to this small room off the main living area, he'd been almost apologetic about its simplicity. But to Delilah, who had spent recent weeks sleeping on floors and in barns, the clean bed with its hand-sewn quilt felt like luxury. The room held a dresser, a washstand, and a small chair by the window that looked out over the valley. It was more than she'd dared to hope for. She dressed quickly in her everyday dress, the only other one she owned, and made her way downstairs. Bear was standing at the kitchen stove, his massive frame somehow managing to look awkward as he attempted to flip eggs in a cast-iron pan. The contrast between his size and the delicate domestic task made Delilah smile despite her nervousness. "Good morning," she said softly, not wanting to startle him. Bear turned, and she was struck again by how gentle his eyes were despite his intimidating size. "Morning, Mrs. Dalton. I hope the bed was comfortable." Mrs. Dalton. The name still felt strange, but it also felt like armor against a world that had little sympathy for unmarried pregnant women. "Very comfortable, thank you," she said. "Can I help with breakfast?" Bear gestured helplessly at the stove. "I'm not much of a cook, I'm afraid. Usually just make coffee and fry whatever's handy." Delilah moved to his side, careful not to crowd him in the small kitchen space. "May I?" she asked, indicating the pan. Bear stepped back gratefully, and Delilah took over the cooking. As she worked, she became aware of a leather-bound book sitting open on the kitchen table. The pages were yellowed with age and covered in careful handwriting. "Is that a recipe book?" she asked. Bear's face softened. "It was my mother's. She wrote down everything she knew about cooking and keeping house. I've been trying to follow some of the recipes, but I'm not very good at it." Delilah felt a flutter of emotion at the thought of this large, solitary man trying to recreate his mother's cooking from faded recipes. "Would you mind if I looked at it sometime? I'd love to learn how she did things." "She'd have liked that," Bear said quietly. "She always said a house wasn't a home without good cooking and the smell of fresh bread." As Delilah finished preparing breakfast eggs, bacon, and biscuits from a batch Bear had attempted the day before, felt a tentative sense of purpose settling over her. This was something she could do, something she could contribute. The kitchen felt welcoming despite its sparse furnishings, and she found herself imagining small improvements: curtains for the windows, herbs growing on the sill, the warm smell of bread rising. They ate in comfortable silence, Bear clearly enjoying the first well-cooked meal he'd had in some time. Delilah ate slowly, savoring every bite and marveling at the simple luxury of having enough food. When they finished, Bear pushed back from the table and cleared his throat. "I should explain how things work around here," he said. "I usually start early with the animals, feed the horses, check on the cattle, repair fences if needed. Most days I'm back by midday for dinner, then out again until evening. I don't expect you to do anything you're not comfortable with, especially in your condition." Delilah straightened her shoulders. "I'm not fragile, Mr. Dalton. I grew up on a farm. I can help with whatever needs doing." Bear studied her carefully. She was still thin, still showing signs of the hardships she'd endured, but there was a strength in her bearing that he hadn't noticed the day before. "All right," he said, "but you'll tell me if you need to rest." "I will." Bear stood and reached for his hat, hanging by the door. "I'll show you around the place first, let you get your bearings." The tour of the ranch revealed a property that was clearly the result of years of careful work. The barn was well built and well maintained, the fences were in good repair, and the animals looked healthy and content. Bear's pride in his work was evident in every detail, from the neat arrangement of tools in the barn to the way he spoke about each building and pasture. "You've built something wonderful here," Delilah said as they stood looking out over the valley where cattle grazed peacefully. Bear felt a warmth spread through his chest at her words. "It's taken 20 years," he said. "Sometimes I wondered if it was worth the effort, building all this with no one to share it with." They spent the rest of the morning working together, Bear showing Delilah how he liked things done, while she proved her competence with farm tasks. Despite her recent hardships, muscle memory served her well, and Bear found himself impressed with her knowledge and work ethic. When they stopped for the midday meal, Delilah had prepared a simple but hearty stew, using vegetables from Bear's garden and instructions she'd gleaned from his mother's recipe book. The kitchen felt different somehow, warmer and more alive with her presence. "This is excellent," Bear said, genuinely amazed at the difference proper cooking made. "Your mother had excellent recipes," Delilah replied, carefully turning the pages of the old book. She was very thorough with her instructions. As the afternoon wore on, Delilah found herself settling into the rhythm of ranch life more easily than she'd expected. Bear was patient and kind, never making her feel foolish when she needed instruction or reminders about how he preferred things done. His size, which had initially seemed so imposing, began to feel reassuring instead. When a horse spooked at her approach, Bear was there instantly, his calm presence settling the animal. When she struggled to lift a heavy bucket, his hand was there to help before she even asked. That evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Bear opened his mother's recipe book again. "She wrote more than just recipes in here," he said quietly. "Advice about all sorts of things. Listen to this. A home is built one small kindness at a time, like layers of good soil that help everything grow." Delilah smiled at the wisdom in those words. "She sounds like she was a wise woman." She was. She always said the right person would come along when the time was right. Bear glanced at Delilah, then back at the book. Maybe she was right about that too. As Delilah prepared for bed that night, she reflected on the strange turn her life had taken. Yesterday she had been homeless and desperate. Today she had a roof over her head, food in her stomach, and a kind man who treated her with respect despite the unusual circumstances of their marriage. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something more precious than she'd dared to hope for. It was the foundation for a life worth living. 2 weeks into their arrangement, Delilah was beginning to feel truly at home on the mountain ranch. Her body was responding to regular meals and rest, the sharp angles of hunger softening as she regained some of the weight she'd lost. The morning sickness that had plagued her was becoming less frequent, though Bear had learned to recognize the signs and would quietly bring her ginger tea without being asked. This particular morning found them in the barn, where Bear was teaching Delilah to properly saddle one of the gentler horses. His patience seemed endless as he demonstrated the process for the third time, his large hands dwarfing the leather straps as he adjusted them. "The important thing is making sure she's comfortable," he explained, running his hand along the mare's neck. "A horse that trusts you will carry you anywhere." Delilah nodded, though she was still nervous about riding. It had been years since she'd been on horseback, and never while carrying a child. But Bear had insisted that she needed to know how to handle the horses in case of emergency, and she trusted his judgment about such things. "Now you try," he said, stepping back to give her room. Delilah approached the mare carefully, speaking softly as Bear had taught her. The horse stood patiently while she fumbled with the saddle, and when she finally got it positioned correctly, Bear's approving nod filled her with unexpected pride. "Good," he said. "Tomorrow we'll try a short ride around the pasture." As they worked together that morning, Delilah found herself studying Bear when she thought he wasn't looking. There was something almost graceful about the way he moved, despite his size, a careful deliberateness that spoke of years of being mindful of his impact on the world around him. She'd begun to notice other things, Tooth way. He always made sure she had the best portion at meals, how he'd quietly moved the heavier chores to times when she was resting, the gentle tone he used when speaking to the animals. That afternoon, Bear surprised her by producing a piece of wood and a small knife from his pocket as they sat on the porch after the midday meal. "What are you making?" Delilah asked, watching his hands work with surprising delicacy. "A spoon," he said, not looking up from his carving. Thought you might like one that fits your hand better than those big ones in the kitchen." Delilah felt warmth spread through her chest at the thoughtfulness of the gesture. "You don't have to do that." "I know," Bear said simply. "I want to." They sat in comfortable silence as he worked. The only sounds, the soft scraping of the knife and the distant lowing of cattle. Delilah found herself mesmerized by the careful movements of his hands, the way the wood seemed to transform under his touch. When he finally handed her the finished spoon, she was amazed at its perfect proportions and smooth finish. "It's beautiful," she said, running her fingers over the polished wood. "You're very skilled at this." Bear ducked his head, clearly pleased but embarrassed by the praise. "My father taught me, said a man should know how to make things that last." That evening, as Delilah prepared supper using her new spoon, she found herself thinking about the man she'd married. Bear's kindness seemed to run deeper than mere politeness. It was woven into the fabric of who he was. She thought about the careful way he'd helped her down from the wagon that first night, the gentle patience he showed when teaching her ranch tasks, the way he'd carved this spoon simply because he thought it would make her life a little easier. The next few days brought their first real test as a couple. Storm clouds had been building over the mountains, and Bear spent long hours preparing for what promised to be a severe weather front. Delilah watched him work with growing concern, noting the tension in his shoulders as he secured equipment and moved the animals to safer areas. When the storm finally hit, it came with a violence that shook the sturdy log house. Rain lashed against the windows, and wind howled through the trees with a sound like approaching wolves. Delilah had experienced prairie storms before, but nothing quite like this mountain tempest. She was sitting by the fire, trying to concentrate on mending one of Bear's shirts, when a particularly loud crack of thunder made her jump. The needle slipped, pricking her finger, and she let out a small cry of pain and frustration. Bear looked up from the harness he was repairing. "You all right?" "Just clumsy," Delilah said, sucking on her injured finger. Another crash of thunder, closer this time, made the windows rattle. Despite herself, Delilah flinched. Bear set down his work and moved to sit beside her on the small sofa, careful not to crowd her, but close enough that she could feel his solid presence. "First mountain storm?" he asked gently. Delilah nodded, feeling foolish for being afraid. "They're different from prairie storms. More violent somehow." "They can be," Bear agreed, "but this house has weathered worse. My father built it to last." As if to test his words, another gust of wind slammed against the building, making the walls creak ominously. Without thinking, Delilah reached out and grasped Bear's hand. His fingers closed gently around hers, warm and reassuring. "Sorry," she said, starting to pull away, but Bear held on. "Don't be sorry," he said quietly. "I'm here." They sat together as the storm raged outside, Bear's presence as steady and comforting as the mountains themselves. When the wind occasionally died down, they could hear each other breathing, and Delilah found herself acutely aware of the man beside her, the scent of wood smoke and leather that clung to his clothes, the calluses on his palm where their hands touched, the careful way he held her fingers as if she were made of spun glass. "Tell me about your family," she said after a while, wanting to hear his voice over the storm. Bear was quiet for a moment, his thumb unconsciously stroking across her knuckles. "My parents were good people," he said finally. "My father was big like me, but my mother was tiny, barely came up to his chest. People used to wonder how they worked, but they fit together perfectly. She used to say that sometimes the best things come in unexpected packages." "How did they meet?" "She was a schoolteacher who came out from Denver to teach in the town down the valley. My father was working as a blacksmith then, and she brought her horse to him to be shod. He told me later that he fell in love with the way she talked to the horse like it was a person worth knowing." Bear's voice grew soft with memory. "They were married 6 months later." Delilah squeezed his hand gently. "They sound wonderful." "They were. I always hoped I'd find something like what they had, but—" He trailed off, seeming to realize what he was saying. "But—" Bear was quiet for so long that Delilah thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible over the storm. "But I learned early that most people find me frightening rather than appealing." The simple sadness in his words broke Delilah's heart. She turned to face him more fully, studying his profile in the firelight. "I don't find you frightening." Bear met her eyes, something flickering in their depths. "No," he said wonderingly. "You don't, do you?" The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the solid log house, two lonely souls were discovering that sometimes comfort could be found in the most unexpected places. As the evening wore on, they remained on the sofa, hands clasped, sharing stories and watching the fire burn down to embers. When they finally said goodnight and went to their separate rooms, both carried with them the memory of that simple touch and the growing realization that their practical arrangement might be becoming something more. Spring had arrived in earnest, painting the mountain valley in shades of green that made Delilah's heart sing. She stood in the patch of earth behind the house where Bear had helped her break ground for a garden, her hands dirty and her back aching pleasantly from the morning's work. The small mounds of soil held the promise of vegetables that would grace their table come summer carrots, beans, squash, and the herbs she'd always dreamed of growing. "That's looking good," Bear said, approaching from the barn with an armload of wooden stakes. "These should help keep the beans climbing straight." Delilah smiled as she watched him drive the stakes into the ground with careful precision. Everything Bear did was methodical and thorough, whether he was mending fence or helping her plant seeds. His large hands, which could easily crush the delicate seedlings, moved with surprising gentleness as he secured the supports. "Thank you," she said, brushing dirt from her apron. "I never had space for a proper garden before. Thomas always said vegetables were too much trouble when we could buy them in town." Bear paused in his work, noting the way her voice changed when she mentioned her first husband. It was the first time she'd spoken of him in weeks, and Bear could see shadows cross her face whenever the past intruded on their peaceful present. "A woman should have a garden if she wants one," he said simply. "Besides, nothing from town tastes as good as what you grow yourself." As the weeks passed, their partnership deepened in ways neither had expected. Delilah had proven herself invaluable around the ranch, her knowledge of farming and animal husbandry complementing Bear's own skills perfectly. More than that, she'd begun to offer opinions on ranch decisions, and Bear found himself seeking her counsel on matters both large and small. It was during one such discussion that they had their first real disagreement. "We should sell the yearlings to Morrison down the valley," Bear said over breakfast, spreading butter on one of Delilah's fresh biscuits. "He's always paid fair prices." Delilah looked up from her eggs, frowning slightly. "Morrison, didn't you say he was late paying you last year?" "A month or so," Bear admitted, "but his money's always been good eventually." "That month you waited for payment, could you afford to wait that long again?" Delilah asked. "Especially with..." She gestured toward her middle, where her pregnancy was beginning to show, despite the loose dresses she favored. Bear's jaw tightened. "I can provide for my family," he said, a note of stiffness creeping into his voice. "I didn't say you couldn't," Delilah replied, matching his tone. "I'm saying we should consider our options carefully. What about the buyer from Helena who came through last month? He offered cash on delivery." "He offered less money. $10 less for guaranteed payment versus the risk of waiting months for Morrison's check," Delilah pointed out. "Sometimes the certain path is better than the profitable one." They stared at each other across the breakfast table, neither willing to back down. Bear wasn't used to having his decisions questioned, and Delilah wasn't used to being dismissed. The silence stretched between them until Bear abruptly pushed back from the table. "I'll think about it," he said curtly, reaching for his hat. "Bear," Delilah started, but he was already heading for the door. He spent the morning riding the far pastures, ostensibly checking on the cattle, but really trying to sort through his conflicted feelings. Part of him bristled at having his judgment questioned, especially by someone who'd been on the ranch for such a short time. But another part, a larger part than he wanted to admit, recognized the wisdom in Delilah's concerns. When he returned for the midday meal, he found Delilah working in her garden, her movements sharp, with suppressed emotion. She looked up when she heard his horse, but didn't smile as she usually did. "Delilah," he said after dismounting. "About this morning." "You don't have to explain anything to me," she said, turning back to her plants. "It's your ranch, your decision." Bear felt something twist in his chest at the formal tone of her voice. "It's our ranch," he said quietly, "and you were right about Morrison." Delilah's hands stilled in the soil. "What?" "I rode down to check on the Henderson place, you know. They sold to Morrison last fall. They're still waiting for half their money." Bear removed his hat and ran his fingers through his hair. "I'm not used to having someone to discuss things with. I've been making decisions alone for so long that I forgot how much clearer things can be when you have another perspective." Delilah stood slowly, brushing dirt from her hands. "I didn't mean to overstep. I know this isn't a real marriage in the usual sense." "Isn't it?" Bear asked, his brown eyes serious. "We live together, work together, plan for the future together. We're having a child together, even if—" He stopped himself before finishing the thought. "Even if the child isn't yours by blood," Delilah finished softly. Bear stepped closer to her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "That child is mine, in every way that matters," he said with quiet intensity. "Don't ever doubt that." Tears pricked at Delilah's eyes. She'd been so afraid that Bear might change his mind about the baby as her pregnancy progressed, that he might begin to resent the reminder of her past. Instead, he'd grown more protective and caring with each passing day. "I'm sorry about this morning," she said. "I should have found a better way to express my concerns. And I should have listened instead of getting defensive," Bear replied. "We'll contact the Helena buyer tomorrow." Their first argument ended with a handshake that lingered longer than necessary, both of them aware that they'd just navigated their first real test as partners and emerged stronger for it. The following week brought an unexpected visitor that would test their relationship in an entirely different way. Delilah was hanging laundry when she heard the sound of a horse approaching at a fast clip. She looked up to see a woman riding side saddle, her dark hair perfectly arranged despite the long journey up the mountain road. The woman dismounted gracefully and approached with the confident stride of someone accustomed to attention. She was beautiful in a polished way that made Delilah suddenly conscious of her own worn dress and work-roughened hands. "You must be the woman Bear married," the visitor said, her tone pleasant but with an undercurrent that set Delilah's teeth on edge. "I'm Catherine Morrison. I heard the most interesting news in town." Before Delilah could respond, Bear appeared from the barn, and she watched his face change as he recognized the visitor. "Catherine," he said carefully, "what brings you up here?" Catherine smiled, the expression transforming her pretty features into something that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Why, I came to meet your bride, of course, and to see if the rumors are true about this sudden marriage of yours." Delilah felt her stomach tighten as she watched the interplay between Bear and this polished woman who clearly knew him well. The way Catherine looked at Bear with a mixture of familiarity and possession made it clear that their history ran deeper than casual acquaintance. "The rumors?" Delilah asked, forcing her voice to remain steady. Catherine's smile widened. "Oh, my dear, surely you've heard. The whole valley is talking about how Bear Dalton finally found himself a wife. Such a romantic story, though. Some versions are more charitable than others." The threat in those words was clear, and Delilah felt the fragile confidence she'd built over the past weeks begin to crumble under Catherine's appraising gaze. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife as Catherine Morrison stood in the yard, her eyes moving between Bear and Delilah with calculated interest. Delilah could feel herself being measured and found wanting, and the sensation brought back all the insecurities she thought she'd left behind in her desperate past. "Catherine," Bear said again, his voice carefully neutral, "I don't believe you've been properly introduced. This is my wife, Delilah." "Delilah, this is Catherine Morrison. She runs the Morrison Ranch with her father." Catherine extended a gloved hand to Delilah, her grip firm and cool. "How lovely to finally meet you." Bear and I have such a long history together, I simply had to come see the woman who finally captured his heart. The way she emphasized finally made it clear that she considered herself to have had the first claim on Bear's affections. Delilah forced herself to smile politely, though her pulse was racing with an emotion she was reluctant to name. "Would you like some coffee?" Delilah offered, falling back on the basic courtesies her mother had taught her. "I was just about to put some on." "How kind," Catherine said, though her attention had already shifted back to Bear. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by, unannounced. I was riding this way and simply couldn't resist seeing how you've been settling into married life." As they walked toward the house, Delilah caught sight of Catherine's horsey, beautiful mare, with expensive tack that spoke of wealth and privilege. Everything about Catherine, from her perfectly tailored riding habit to her confident manner, screamed of a woman who had never known want or desperation. In the kitchen, Delilah busied herself with preparing coffee, while Catherine settled herself at the table, as if she belonged there. Bear remained standing, his large frame filling the doorway, in a way that suggested he was ready to escort their visitor out at a moment's notice. "You've made some changes to the place," Catherine observed, looking around the kitchen with keen eyes. "New curtains, herbs on the windowsill. How domestic." "Delilah has a gift for making a house feel like a home," Bear said, and Delilah felt a flush of warmth at the pride in his voice. "I'm sure she does," Catherine replied smoothly. "It must be such a comfort to you, Bear, having someone to take care of the household duties. Though, I have to say, I was quite surprised when I heard about your marriage, so sudden and to someone none of us had ever met." Delilah's hands trembled slightly as she poured the coffee, Catherine's words hitting their intended target. The implication was clear that Bear's marriage was either desperate or suspicious, and that Delilah was an outsider who didn't belong in their community. "Sometimes the best things happen when you least expect them," Bear said firmly, moving to stand beside Delilah's chair. "I consider myself a very fortunate man." Catherine's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course you do, though I have to admit, when I heard you'd married, I thought surely it would be to someone we all knew. Remember how we used to talk about settling down together someday?" The casual cruelty of the statement took Delilah's breath away. Bear's jaw clenched, and when he spoke, his voice carried a warning. "That was a long time ago, Catherine. Things change." "Do they?" Catherine asked, her eyes glittering with malice masked as innocent curiosity. "I always thought some connections ran deeper than that. After all, we've known each other since childhood. We understand each other in ways that—" She glanced at Delilah with false sympathy. "Well, in ways that take time to develop." Delilah felt as if she were drowning in the undercurrents of this conversation. The coffee cup in her hands might as well have been lead for all the strength she had to lift it. Every word Catherine spoke reinforced what Delilah had known all along, that she was an interloper in Bear's life. A woman who had trapped him into marriage through desperation, rather than winning him through any genuine attraction. "I think you should go," Bear said suddenly, his voice low and dangerous. Catherine's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Oh my, have I said something wrong? I was simply expressing how happy I am that you found companionship, even if it is unconventional." Bear took a step forward, his size suddenly intimidating in a way that Delilah had never experienced. "Get out, now." For the first time since her arrival, Catherine's composure cracked slightly. She rose from her chair with stiff dignity, gathering her riding gloves and small purse. "Of course, if that's how you feel," she said, her voice cooling several degrees. "I certainly didn't mean to overstay my welcome. Delilah, it was so interesting to meet you. I do hope we'll have the chance to get better acquainted soon." The threat in those words was unmistakable, and Delilah nodded mutely, not trusting her voice to remain steady. Bear escorted Catherine to her horse in silence, his entire posture radiating controlled anger. Delilah watched from the kitchen window as they spoke in low voices by the mare, Catherine's hand resting on Bear's arm in a gesture of easy familiarity that made Delilah's stomach clench with jealousy. When Bear finally returned to the kitchen, he found Delilah still sitting at the table, staring into her untouched coffee cup. "She's gone," he said simply. Delilah nodded but didn't look up. She's very beautiful. Bear sat down heavily in the chair Catherine had vacated. She's also cruel and manipulative. But you cared for her once. It wasn't a question. Bear was quiet for a long moment. I thought I did, he said finally. When I was younger and didn't know any better, Catherine has a way of making a man feel important, at least until she finds someone more useful. More useful than you? Delilah asked, finally meeting his eyes. Her father's been trying to merge our ranches for years. Catherine was part of that plan until she decided I wasn't successful enough for her tastes. She married a banker from Helena instead, but he died 2 years ago and left her with debts her family ranch can't cover. Understanding dawned in Delilah's eyes. She's looking for another solution to her financial problems. And when she heard I'd married, she came to see if she could still salvage her plans, Bear confirmed. Catherine doesn't give up easily when she wants something. Delilah felt a chill run down her spine. What does she want? Bear reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb stroking gently across her knuckles. It doesn't matter what she wants. What matters is what I want. And I want you and our child. Don't let her poison what we're building here. But even as Delilah nodded and squeezed his hand in return, she couldn't shake the feeling that Catherine Morrison wasn't done with them yet. The other woman's parting words echoed in her mind, and she wondered what form that better acquaintance might take. That evening, Bear surprised Delilah by producing something from his shirt pocket as they sat by the fire. It was his grandfather's pocket watch, a beautiful silver piece that caught the lamplight and threw it back in gentle gleams. This belonged to my grandfather, and his grandfather before him, Bear said, placing it carefully in Delilah's hands. It's been in my family for 3 generations. Delilah stared at the watch, understanding the significance of the gesture. Bear, I can't accept this. It's too valuable. It belongs to my wife, Bear said firmly. And you're my wife, Delilah. Not because of desperation or convenience, but because I choose you. Every day I choose you. Tears sprang to Delilah's eyes as she clutched the watch to her chest. Catherine's visit had shaken her confidence, but Bear's gesture and his words restored something vital in her soul. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The morning started like any other, with Bear heading out to check the cattle and Delilah tending to her garden. Her pregnancy was now impossible to hide, her belly round and full beneath her loosened dresses. She'd felt the baby moving for weeks now, small flutters that filled her with wonder and made Bear's eyes light up whenever she shared the news of a particularly strong kick. She was hanging laundry on the line when she heard the sound of horses approaching. Looking up, she saw 2 men riding toward the house, their official bearing immediately setting her on edge. One wore a badge that caught the sunlight, and both had the serious expressions of men carrying unwelcome news. Mrs. Dalton, the sheriff called as he dismounted. I'm Sheriff Williams from Bitter Creek. This here is Deputy Morrison. The name Morrison made Delilah's blood run cold, and she wondered if this visit was somehow connected to Catherine's threatening words from the week before. She nodded warily, her hands instinctively moving to protect her belly. Is your husband about? Sheriff Williams asked, his tone professionally polite, but with an undercurrent that suggested this wasn't a social call. He's out with the cattle, Delilah said, her voice steadier than she felt. Can I help you with something? The sheriff and deputy exchanged glances. Ma'am, I'm afraid we need to speak with both of you about a legal matter. It concerns your previous marriage. Delilah felt the world tilt beneath her feet. My previous marriage. To Thomas Ross, the sheriff confirmed, pulling a folded document from his coat pocket. Ma'am, I'm afraid I have some difficult news. Your husband Thomas isn't dead as you might have believed. The words hit Delilah like a physical blow. She grabbed the porch railing to keep from falling, her mind reeling with the implications. That's impossible. He left months ago. I haven't heard from him since. No, Mum, he didn't die, Sheriff Williams said gently. He was arrested for fraud and forgery in Colorado Territory. He's currently serving time in the territorial prison. The problem is, Ma'am, That means your marriage to Mr. Dalton isn't legal." The document crackled as Delilah's trembling hands tried to unfold it. The official seal and formal language swam before her eyes, but the meaning was clear enough. Thomas Ross, her legal husband, was alive and imprisoned. Her marriage to Bear was invalid. Her child would be born illegitimate. "There's more, ma'am," Deputy Morrison said, speaking for the first time. His voice held a note of barely concealed satisfaction that made Delilah look at him more closely. He had the same dark hair and calculating eyes as Catherine, and she realized this must be Catherine's brother. "What more?" she whispered. "Your husband accumulated significant debts before his arrest," Deputy Morrison continued. "Debts that, as his legal wife, you're responsible for. There are also questions about the ownership of property acquired during what turns out to be an illegal marriage." Sheriff Williams shot his deputy a sharp look. "Now, hold on, Morrison. Let's not get ahead of ourselves here." But the damage was done. Delilah understood the threat perfectly. Not only was her marriage to Bear invalid, but her very presence on his ranch could potentially create legal complications for him. Everything she'd built, every moment of happiness she'd found, was crumbling around her. The sound of Bear's horse approaching at a gallop told her that someone had seen the sheriff's visit and gone to fetch him. He dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, his eyes immediately finding Delilah's pale face. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man defending his territory. Sheriff Williams straightened. "Mr. Dalton, I'm afraid we've brought some difficult news about your wife's legal status." Bear's face went very still as the sheriff explained the situation. Delilah watched her husband her, not husband. She reminded herself with bitter accuracy process, the information. His jaw tightened with each word, but his eyes never left her face. "So what you're telling me," Bear said slowly when the sheriff finished, "is that my wife isn't legally my wife, and my child isn't legally my child." "That's correct, sir," Sheriff Williams confirmed. "The marriage ceremony you had was performed in good faith, but it's not legally binding. And there are potential financial and property complications," Deputy Morrison added with poorly concealed eagerness. "Any assets acquired during the illegal marriage could be subject to claims from Mr. Ross's creditors." Bear's massive frame seemed to expand as he took a step toward the deputy. "Are you threatening me?" "Just explaining the legal realities," Morrison replied, though he took an unconscious step backward. Bear turned to Delilah, who was still gripping the porch railing, as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. "What do you want to do?" he asked quietly. The simple question broke something inside Delilah. Here was this good man, facing the destruction of everything he'd worked for because of her past, and he was asking what she wanted to do. The selflessness of it, the complete absence of blame or anger in his voice, made her realize how deeply she'd come to love him. "I should go," she said, the words tearing at her throat. "I've brought nothing but trouble to your life. You deserve better than this." Bear's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "That's not what I asked. I asked what you want to do." Delilah looked at this man who had saved her life, who had given her hope and dignity and love, and felt her heart breaking. "I want to stay," she whispered, "but I can't let my problems destroy you." "Ma'am," Sheriff Williams interjected gently, "there might be a solution. If your husband could be convinced to agree to a divorce, it would clear the way for you to remarry legally." Deputy Morrison's face darkened. "Thomas Ross isn't likely to cooperate. He's not exactly in a position to be charitable." "What would it take?" Bear asked, his mind already working on the problem. "A trip to the territorial prison," Sheriff Williams said. "Someone would have to go there and convince him to sign the papers. It's not without risk. Ross has a reputation for violence, and prison hasn't improved his temperament." Bear nodded slowly. "How long would it take to arrange?" "A few days to get the proper documentation," the sheriff replied. "Then it's a week's ride to the prison, assuming the weather holds." "Bear, no," Delilah said, understanding his intention. "It's too dangerous, Thomas. When he's angry, he's not rational. If he knows you're there because of me..." Bear moved to stand beside her, his presence solid and reassuring despite the chaos surrounding them. "He can't hurt us anymore, Delilah. Whatever it takes to make this right, I'll do it." "Mr. Dalton," Deputy Morrison said with false concern, "you should consider the risks carefully. Prison is a dangerous place, and Ross has nothing left to lose. There's also the matter of your ranch's legal status during this situation." The threat was clear, and Bear understood it perfectly. Catherine and her family were positioning themselves to take advantage of this crisis, possibly even to force Bear into a marriage alliance to protect his property. "I appreciate your concern," Bear said with deadly calm, "but I'll handle my own affairs." After the sheriff and deputy left, Bear and Delilah sat on the porch in stunned silence. The legal document lay between them like a barrier, its official language spelling out the destruction of everything they'd built together. "I'm so sorry," Delilah said finally, tears streaming down her face. "I thought he was gone forever. I never meant for this to happen." Bear reached over and took her hand, his fingers warm and steady. "This isn't your fault. Thomas made his choices, and now we'll deal with the consequences. But your ranch, your reputation, can all be rebuilt," Bear interrupted. "What matters is keeping our family together." Delilah looked up at him through her tears. "Even if it means facing Thomas? Even if it means risking everything?" Bear's answer was simple and sure, especially then. As the sun set behind the mountains, they sat together planning for a journey that would determine the course of their lives. The legal document that had shattered their world that morning now served as a reminder of what they were fighting for: the right to love each other freely without the shadows of the past threatening their future. The 3 days that followed the sheriff's visit passed in a blur of tense preparation. Bear worked with quiet determination to arrange his affairs before leaving for the territorial prison, while Delilah struggled with the weight of watching her husband risk everything for a love that might not even be legally recognized. On the kitchen table sat a small tin box that Bear had retrieved from its hiding place beneath a loose floorboard in the barn. Inside were carefully counted bills and coins, 30 years of savings, money he'd been setting aside for improvements to the ranch, for the future he'd dreamed of but never expected to have. Now it would serve as traveling expenses and, if necessary, a bribe to convince Thomas Ross that cooperation was in his best interest. "You don't have to do this," Delilah said for what felt like the 100th time as she watched Bear count the money. "We could just live as we are. Common law marriages aren't unheard of on the frontier." Bear looked up from the bills, his brown eyes serious. "And have our child grow up with whispers following them everywhere? Have you always looking over your shoulder, wondering when someone like Deputy Morrison might decide to cause trouble?" He shook his head firmly. "No, we're going to make this right." The legal papers Sheriff Williams had prepared lay neatly folded in Bear's coat pocket: divorce documents that would free Delilah from her marriage to Thomas and clear the way for them to remarry properly. Everything hinged on getting one violent, bitter man to sign his name. "Tell me about him," Bear said quietly as they sat by the fire that evening. "Tell me about Thomas, so I know what I'm walking into." Delilah's hands moved protectively over her belly, where the baby had been unusually active all day, as if sensing her mother's distress. "He wasn't always bad," she said slowly. "When we first married, he was charming, ambitious. He had big dreams about making our farm successful." "What changed?" "The drought hit, and crops failed 2 years running. Thomas couldn't accept that sometimes nature wins, no matter how hard you work. He started gambling, thinking he could win back what we'd lost. When that failed, he began forging documents, falsifying crop reports to get more credit from the bank." Delilah's voice grew smaller. "When I tried to talk to him about it, he got angry, very angry." Bear's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice gentle. "Did he hurt you?" Delilah nodded, her eyes fixed on the fire. "Not at first, but toward the end, when the debts were piling up and the bank was threatening foreclosure, he became someone I didn't recognize. The night before he left, he hit me so hard I couldn't see straight for an hour." "And you never heard from him after he disappeared?" "Nothing. I thought, I hoped, that maybe he'd gotten himself killed in some gambling den or saloon fight. It would have been easier than this. She looked up at Bear, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I'm terrified of what he'll do when he sees you. Thomas doesn't handle being shown up by other men, and you're everything he never was: strong, successful, honorable. Bear moved to sit beside her on the small sofa, carefully taking her into his arms. He can't hurt us anymore, Delilah. He's behind bars, and I'm not some desperate farmer he can intimidate. But what if he refuses to sign? What if he demands something we can't give? Then we'll figure out another way, Bear said firmly. I won't lose you to a man who abandoned you when you needed him most. The next morning brought unexpected visitors, neighbors from the valley who had heard about their legal troubles through the Frontier's efficient gossip network. Old Pete Mackenzie was the first to arrive, his weathered face creased with concern. Heard you're having some difficulties, Pete said without preamble, as Bear invited him into the kitchen. Come to see what I can do to help. More neighbors followed throughout the day. The Hendersons from the next ranch over, the widow Clearwater who ran the general store in town, even the pastor who had married them. Each brought offers of support that touched Delilah deeply and surprised Bear, who had always thought of himself as a solitary figure in the community. We stand by our own, Mrs. Henderson said firmly when Bear tried to protest their generosity. You've been good neighbors, and good neighbors help each other through troubles. Pastor Williams pulled Bear aside as the afternoon wore on. Son, I want you to know that no matter what those legal papers say, in God's eyes and in the eyes of this community, Delilah is your wife, and that baby is your child. Don't let anyone tell you different. The validation meant more to Bear than he could express. For so many years, he'd felt like an outsider, too big and too intimidating to fit comfortably into the social fabric of the valley. Now he was discovering that acceptance had been there all along, waiting for him to claim it. That evening, as their neighbors finally departed with promises to check on Delilah while Bear was away, he found his wife sitting in the nursery they'd been preparing. The room was small but carefully arranged, with a crib Bear had built by hand and baby clothes Delilah had sewn during the long winter evenings. I keep thinking about what kind of world we're bringing this child into, Delilah said, one hand resting on her belly. All this uncertainty, all this conflict. Bear knelt beside her chair, covering her hand with his much larger one. We're bringing our child into a world where people fight for what matters, he said. Where love is worth risking everything for. That's not such a bad legacy. The baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly strong kick, making both parents smile despite their worries. Bear had felt the baby move several times now, and each instance filled him with wonder at the miracle growing within Delilah. Whatever happens at that prison, Delilah said softly, I want you to know that these months with you have been the happiest of my life. You gave me hope when I had none, dignity when I'd lost it all, and love when I thought I was unworthy of it. Bear felt his throat tighten with emotion. You gave me everything I'd stopped believing I could have, he replied. A family, a home that feels alive instead of empty, a reason to build something beyond just surviving each day. They spent their last evening together quietly, both trying to memorize details they might need to sustain them through the difficult days ahead. The way lamplight caught in Delilah's hair, the sound of Bear's deep voice reading from his mother's journal, the peaceful weight of the baby moving between them, all of it precious beyond measure. The morning of Bear's departure arrived too soon. He loaded his saddlebags with provisions for the long journey, checked his weapons, and made final arrangements with Pete Mackenzie to keep an eye on the ranch. The divorce papers were secured in an oilskin pouch, along with most of his savings, and a letter from Pastor Williams attesting to their desire to remarry legally. I'll be back within 2 weeks, Bear promised as he held Delilah close beside his saddled horse. 3 at the most if the weather turns bad. What if Thomas? Bear silenced her fears with a gentle kiss. Thomas Ross had his chance at happiness with you and threw it away. He doesn't get a second chance to destroy what we've built. Delilah clung to him for a moment longer, breathing in the familiar scent of leather and wood smoke that always clung to his clothes. "I love you," she whispered against his chest. "Come back to us." "I love you too," Bear replied, the words still feeling new and wonderful on his tongue. "Both of you." As Bear rode down the mountain road toward the main trail, Delilah stood on the porch watching until he disappeared around a bend in the trees. She placed both hands on her belly, feeling the baby's restless movements, and whispered a prayer for the safety of the man who had become her whole world. The tin box that had held their savings now sat empty on the kitchen table, a reminder of how much they were risking for the chance at a legal future together. Everything Bear had worked for, everything they had built, now depended on the cooperation of a man who had already proven he cared nothing for Delilah's welfare. But as Delilah settled in to wait for Bear's return, she found herself sustained by the memory of their neighbor's support and the strength she'd discovered within herself over these transformative months. Whatever Thomas Ross decided, whatever challenges lay ahead, she was no longer the desperate, starving woman who had begged for mercy in a frontier saloon. She was Bear Dalton's wife in every way that mattered, and that knowledge would carry her through whatever darkness was coming. Bear's journey to the territorial prison took him through country that grew increasingly harsh and unforgiving with each passing mile. The mountains gave way to barren hills, then to scrubland that stretched endlessly under a pitiless sun. By the time he reached the prison, walls, massive stone barriers that rose from the desert like monuments to human misery, he understood why men feared being sent to this place. The warden was a tired-looking man named Collins, who had clearly seen too much of human nature's darker side. He listened to Bear's request with weary patience, occasionally glancing at the official papers Bear presented. "Thomas Ross," Collins mused, consulting a ledger thick with entries. "Cell block D. I have to warn you, Mr. Dalton, Ross isn't what you'd call a model prisoner. He's been in 3 fights since he arrived, and he has a particular hatred for anyone he perceives as having wronged him." "I understand the risks," Bear replied, "but I need to speak with him." The visiting room was a stark chamber with a wooden table scarred by years of desperate conversations. Bear waited, his hat in his hands, as footsteps echoed in the corridor beyond the heavy door. When it finally opened, the man who shuffled in wearing prison stripes bore little resemblance to the charming farmer Delilah had once described. Thomas Ross had been diminished by prison life, his frame thin and his face marked by the kind of hard living that aged a man before his time. But his eyes, those, were still sharp, with the bitter intelligence that had gotten him into this place. When he saw Bear, those eyes narrowed with immediate suspicion. "So you're the giant who married my wife," Thomas said as he settled into the chair across from Bear. His voice carried the flat accent of a man who had learned to show no weakness. "Come to gloat, have you?" "I've come to offer you a way out of a situation that benefits no one," Bear replied calmly. Despite his size advantage, he could sense the coiled violence in the smaller man, the unpredictability of someone with nothing left to lose. Thomas laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "A way out? Friend, I'm serving 8 years for forgery and fraud. The only way out of here is in a pine box." Bear placed the divorce papers on the scarred table between them. "Your wife needs legal freedom to remarry. You sign these papers, and I'll make it worth your while." "My wife?" Thomas leaned forward, his face twisting with ugly emotion. "You mean the whore who couldn't wait a month before spreading her legs for another man?" Bear's massive hands clenched into fists on the table, but his voice remained steady. "Watch your mouth when you talk about her." "Or what?" Thomas sneered. "You'll fight me? In here, surrounded by guards? You're not as smart as you look, giant." "Delilah was starving when I found her," Bear said, forcing himself to stay calm. "Pregnant and desperate because you abandoned her. What kind of man does that?" Thomas's face darkened. "What kind of man steals another man's wife and tries to pretend it's legal? At least I'm honest about what I am." Bear slid the oilskin pouch across the table. $500, more money than you'll see in 8 years of prison work. Sign the papers, and it's yours." Thomas opened the pouch and counted the bills with practiced fingers. Bear could see the calculation in his eyes, weighing greed against spite. For a moment, hope flickered in Bear's chest as Thomas picked up the pen Bear had provided. Then Thomas smiled, a cold expression that made Bear's skin crawl, and tore the divorce papers in half. "You think I'm going to make this easy for you?" Thomas said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You think I'm going to let you walk away with my wife, my child, my life, for a handful of money?" "That child isn't yours," Bear said, his patience finally fraying. "You left before it was conceived." "Prove it," Thomas replied. "In a court of law, that baby is mine. Delilah is mine, and there's not a damn thing you can do about it from your little mountain paradise." Bear leaned forward, his size suddenly intimidating, even in the confines of the visiting room. "You don't want her. You never did. Why not let her go?" "Because I can't have her, and I sure as hell won't let you have her either," Thomas snarled. "You want to know what I'm going to do? I'm going to write letters. To the territorial government, to the newspapers, to anyone who'll listen. I'm going to tell them about the giant who stole a man's wife while he was wrongfully imprisoned. I'm going to make your life hell from inside these walls." The threat hung in the air between them like poison. Bear realized he was looking at a man who would destroy everyone around him rather than admit his own failures. Thomas Ross was willing to condemn Delilah and their unborn child to a life of shame and uncertainty out of pure vindictiveness. "Sign the papers," Bear said quietly, his voice carrying a note of finality that made even Thomas pause. "Or what?" Bear's answer was swift and decisive. He reached across the table, grasped Thomas by the front of his prison shirt, and lifted him partially out of his chair. The smaller man's feet barely touched the floor as Bear's massive strength held him suspended. "Or I'll make sure your remaining years in this place are much less comfortable than they've been so far," Bear said in a voice barely above a whisper. "I know people, Ross. People who can make things happen, even behind these walls." Thomas's face went pale as he realized he had finally pushed too far. In Bear's eyes, he saw something that chilled him to the bone, no just physical threat, but the implacable determination of a man protecting his family. "The papers," Bear said again, setting Thomas back in his chair, but not releasing his grip. "Sign them, now." Thomas Ross signed the divorce papers with shaking hands, his defiance crumbling under Bear's unwavering stare. As soon as the ink dried, Bear released his grip and stepped back, the official documents disappearing into his coat pocket with swift efficiency. "This doesn't end here," Thomas spat, trying to salvage some dignity from his defeat. "I'll find ways to cause trouble for you, giant. Count on it." Bear looked down at the bitter man with something approaching pity. "You've already lost everything that mattered. Don't lose what little time you have left fighting battles that can't be won." The ride back to the ranch took Bear 6 days through increasingly difficult weather. Spring storms turned the mountain roads treacherous, and twice he was forced to take shelter as rain turned to sleet and back again. But the signed papers in his pocket drove him forward with relentless determination. It was past midnight when he finally crested the ridge above his valley, and what he saw below made his blood run cold. Light blazed from every window of his house, and several horses were tied at his hitching post. Something was terribly wrong. Bear spurred his exhausted mount down the mountain road, his heart hammering with fear for Delilah and their unborn child. As he drew closer to the house, he could see figures moving inside, and the sound of women's voices carried on the night air. He burst through the front door to find his kitchen full of neighbors. Mrs. Henderson stirring something at the stove, the widow Clearwater organizing supplies on the table, and Pastor William's wife heating water. All heads turned as he entered, their faces grave with concern. "Bear!" Mrs. Henderson rushed to him, her face tight with worry. "Thank God you're back. It's Delilah, the baby's coming, and something's not right." Bear felt the world tilt beneath his feet. "How long?" "Since this morning," Mrs. Clearwater replied. "The labor started sudden, and it's been difficult. We sent for Doc Patterson, but he's attending another birth down valley. Won't be here until tomorrow, at the earliest." A cry of pain from upstairs sent Bear moving toward the stairs, 2 at a time. but Mrs. Henderson caught his arm. "You can't go up there right now," she said firmly. "This is women's work, and you'll only be in the way, but she's been asking for you, calling your name." Another cry, weaker this time, drifted down from the bedroom. Bear felt helpless rage surge through him. He had risked everything to secure their legal future, only to return and find their child fighting to enter the world under circumstances that could claim both mother and baby. "What can I do?" he asked, his voice hoarse with desperation. "Pray," Pastor Williams's wife said simply, "and keep that fire stoked. We need all the hot water we can get." The next hours passed in a blur of helpless waiting. Bear paced the kitchen like a caged animal, starting at every sound from upstairs. The women took turns going up to check on Delilah, their faces growing more concerned with each visit. Just as dawn was breaking, a new sound filled the house, the thin, outraged cry of a newborn. Bear froze, his heart stopping as he waited for what would come next. The cry came again, stronger this time, followed by the sound of women's voices raised in relief and celebration. Mrs. Henderson appeared at the top of the stairs, her face wreathed in smiles despite her exhaustion. "Bear Dalton, come meet your daughter." Bear took the stairs 3 at a time, his legs trembling with emotion and fatigue. He paused at the bedroom door, suddenly aware of what a sight he must present days, of travel evident in his clothes and beard, his eyes wild with worry and hope. Delilah lay propped against pillows, pale but radiant, cradling a small bundle wrapped in the baby blanket she had knitted during the long winter evenings. When she looked up and saw Bear in the doorway, her face transformed with joy. "She's here," Delilah whispered, her voice hoarse from hours of labor. "Our daughter is here." Bear approached the bed slowly, as if afraid he might be dreaming. When Delilah pulled back the blanket to reveal their child's face, he felt his knees go weak. The baby was perfect, tiny features already showing character, a crown of dark hair, and eyes that seemed to look directly at him with ancient wisdom. "She's beautiful," he breathed, carefully taking the baby when Delilah offered her. His massive hands seemed impossibly gentle as they supported the tiny form, and when the baby's fingers closed around one of his, he felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of what it meant to be alive. "Did you get the papers signed?" Delilah asked, though her voice suggested the answer mattered less now than it had before. Bear reached into his coat and pulled out the divorce decree, now properly witnessed and sealed. "We're free," he said simply. "We can be married legally as soon as you're ready." Delilah smiled through her tears. "I've been ready since the day I met you." As the sun rose fully over the mountain valley, Bear sat beside his wife and daughter, the signed papers forgotten on the nightstand. The legal battles and uncertainties that had plagued them seemed distant now, overwhelmed by the immediate reality of new life and the love that had brought them through every trial. Their family was complete, their future secured, and the baby in Bear's arms was living proof that sometimes the greatest blessings grow from the most desperate beginnings. 1 year later, the mountain valley glowed with the golden light of early autumn as Delilah stood in her flourishing garden, watching her daughter take her first unsteady steps across the grass. Little Sarah Dalton, named for Bear's mother, had inherited her father's determination and her mother's bright spirit, and at 10 months old, she was already showing signs of the strong will that would serve her well in frontier life. "Come on, sweetheart," Delilah called softly, kneeling with her arms outstretched as Sarah wobbled toward her on chubby legs. "Come to Mama." The baby took 3 more steps before tumbling onto her bottom, with a giggle that rang like music across the peaceful yard. Bear emerged from the barn at the sound, his face breaking into the smile that still had the power to make Delilah's heart skip a beat. "Did I miss it?" he asked, jogging over to scoop Sarah up and spin her in the air. "Did our little bird finally take flight?" "Her first real steps," Delilah confirmed, standing and brushing dirt from her apron. "She's determined to keep up with her papa." Bear settled Sarah on his broad shoulders, where she had taken to riding whenever he worked around the ranch. The sight of the massive man with the tiny child perched fearlessly above him had become a familiar one to their neighbors, a symbol of the gentle giant who had found his purpose in protecting and nurturing his family. The ranch itself had prospered beyond Bear's wildest dreams. The cattle herd had grown substantially. The vegetable garden produced more than they could eat, and Bear had begun construction on additional outbuildings to accommodate their expanding operation. But more than material success, the ranch had become a true home filled with laughter, love, and the countless small joys that made each day precious. Their legal remarriage had taken place in the same small church where they'd first exchanged vows, but this ceremony had been attended by half the valley. Pastor Williams had spoken movingly about the power of love to overcome any obstacle, and the celebration afterward had lasted until well past midnight. The community that had once viewed Bear as an intimidating outsider now embraced him as one of their own, and Delilah as the woman who had brought out the best in their gentle giant. "Mama, Papa," Sarah babbled from her perch, pointing at something in the distance. Following her gaze, they saw a rider approaching on the mountain road. As the figure drew closer, Delilah recognized the postal rider who made weekly deliveries to the scattered ranches in their valley. "Afternoon, folks," the rider called as he approached. "Got a letter here for Mrs. Delilah Dalton." Delilah accepted the envelope with curiosity, noting the careful handwriting and the Denver postmark. Her heart caught as she recognized the script. It was from her sister Martha, whom she hadn't heard from in over 2 years. "What is it?" Bear asked, noting the change in her expression. "It's from Martha," Delilah said, carefully opening the envelope. "I wrote to her months ago, telling her about you and Sarah, but I wasn't sure she'd received it." The letter was brief, but warm, full of joy at learning that Delilah had found happiness after the disasters of her first marriage. Martha wrote that she was planning to visit in the spring, eager to meet the man who had captured her sister's heart and the niece she'd never seen. "She wants to come visit," Delilah said, tears of happiness pricking her eyes. "She says she's proud of me for having the courage to start over." Bear wrapped his free arm around his wife, pulling her close, while Sarah continued her babbled commentary on the world from her elevated position. "Family is always welcome here," he said simply. As evening approached, they gathered on the front porch for their daily ritual. Bear had built a larger porch the previous summer, with comfortable chairs and a view that encompassed their entire valley. It was here that they spent their evenings, watching the sun set behind the mountains, while Sarah played at their feet. Tonight, Bear surprised Delilah by producing a wrapped package from behind his chair. "What's this?" she asked, accepting the gift with puzzled delight. "Open it and see." Inside the brown paper was a picture frame, beautifully crafted from the same wood Bear used for his carving projects. The frame held a photograph taken at their legal wedding ceremony. 3 of them posed formally, but with unmistakable joy radiating from their faces. "You made this?" Delilah asked, running her fingers over the intricate design Bear had carved around the edges. "Figured it was time we had a proper family portrait displayed," Bear said, his voice gruff with emotion. "Something to show Sarah when she's older, so she'll know how happy we were when she came into our lives." Delilah set the framed photograph on the small table beside her chair, where the evening light caught the polished wood and made it glow. In the picture, Bear's massive frame dwarfed both his wife and daughter, but his expression was one of pure contentment. Delilah looked radiant in her wedding dresser, new one this time, made specially for their legal ceremony and baby. Sarah gazed up at her parents with the serene confidence of a child who had never known want or fear. "Do you ever think about that day in the saloon?" Delilah asked, as they settled in to watch the sunset. "When I dropped to my knees and begged you to marry me?" Bear considered the question, absently stroking Sarah's hair as she dozed against his chest. "I think about how brave you were," he said finally. "How desperate you must have been, but still brave enough to ask for what you needed." "I think about how gentle you were," Delilah replied. "How you could have taken advantage of my desperation, but instead you gave me dignity and respect. And look what it brought us," Bear said, gesturing toward their thriving ranch and the sleeping child in his arms. "Sometimes the most desperate moments lead to the greatest blessings." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Bear and Delilah sat in comfortable silence, their hands linked across the space between their chairs. The baby's soft breathing and the distant sound of cattle settling for the night created a peaceful symphony that spoke of home, security, and love that had grown stronger through every trial. In the photograph beside them, their captured smiles served as a testament to the truth Bear had spoken, that sometimes life's greatest gifts come wrapped in packages we never expected, and that love, when it's real and true, can indeed transform everything it touches.